I'm going to start by quoting Bart Ehrman on what we agree on about Jesus, because we're not going to go over all this stuff that is accepted by most scholars and by both of us, even though we're not scholars. Bart Ehrman. So Bart Ehrman is an atheist. He is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is a leading authority on the Bible and the life of Jesus. And he wrote this book recently. He initially got famous and rich for writing anti-Christian books, but then recently he wrote this book, which is establishing that Jesus really did exist and talking about what we really know about him. So here he's talking about the people who argue that Jesus did not exist, the Christ mythicists. And so example of this is like Bill Maher or like Zeitgeist, for example. And anyway, this is what he has to say about it as an atheist, Bible scholar and historian. I should say at the outset that none of this literature is written by scholars trained in New Testament or early Christian studies, teaching at the major or even the minor accredited theological seminaries, divinity schools, universities, or colleges of North America or Europe or anywhere else in the world. Of the thousands of scholars of early Christianity who do teach at such schools, none of them, to my knowledge, has any doubts that Jesus existed. There are several points on which virtually all scholars of antiquity agree. Jesus was a Jewish man, known to be a preacher and teacher, who was crucified, a Roman form of execution, in Jerusalem during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea. Even though this is the view of nearly every trained scholar on the planet, it is not the view of a group of writers who are usually labeled and often label themselves mythicists. So this is kind of what we're agreeing on ahead of time, and we're not going to go into the details of explaining why we believe this. So there's 6 major non-Christian sources. There are other minor ones that aren't really important for this discussion, I don't think. 4 of them are Roman, 2 of them are Jewish. So the 2 biggest Roman ones are Tacitus and Suetonius, 2 prominent Roman historians. They both mention the Christians and explain who the Christians are. They say the Christians are this group of people who worship this guy Christ, and the group was started by this guy, well, Christus, they say, and they seem to think that this is his name, because to them, Christus, which just means anointed one, or the one who has oil poured on them, this doesn't mean anything to them. The idea of a Messiah is not meaningful to pagan Romans. So they think this is just this guy's name. And so in Jewish sources, of course, they don't refer to him as the Messiah. They don't use the Christus term. And both Tacitus and Suetonius mention that this guy was crucified by Pontius Pilate. And they both have a very, very low opinion of Christians. Tacitus explains why people don't like Christians. He says it's because they are universally disliked because of their hatred of the human race, and because they believe in a evil superstition, which is probably the resurrection or something like that. And yet they both affirm that Jesus was this Jewish man who was crucified by Pontius Pilate. So they must, I would say it's reasonable to say they have other sources for this, because they're not going to trust the Christians on anything, because they have no respect for the Christians. So they must have had some other source for thinking he was crucified. Okay, 2 more Roman sources. Celsus is a pagan who is writing against Christianity, and then Origen, a Christian apologist, responds. So we have parts of that debate between the 2 of them. And it's interesting that Celsus, when he attacks Christianity, he is pretty vicious in his attacks, but he assumes throughout the entire debate that of course Jesus existed and of course he was crucified. Right? So if this guy was made up, the first thing you would say was that this guy didn't exist, right? That would be the first line of attack. And another interesting thing about his attacks is that he doesn't deny the miracles, which is also what we see in Jewish sources. They don't deny the miracles. They say that the miracles are sorcery or black magic, or that they're done through the power of Satan. This is one of Celsus's attacks, actually. He says that Jesus was a small and an ugly man who collected a group of fishermen and tax collectors and impressed them with his sorcery and black magic. And then he was crucified as a criminal, which basically discredits him in the eyes of Romans and Jews. The fact that he was crucified as a criminal is like the ultimate way of discrediting this guy. which is important later because of the idea that this was made up is really absurd. This is the last thing that any Jew would make up if they're trying to say that someone is the Messiah, was that he was crucified. So the three Roman sources I mentioned were Tacitus, Suetonius, and Celsus. Pliny the Younger is another important one.
And is Origen Roman?
Origen is an early Christian church father who had a debate, written debate, with Celsus. Yeah. So Pliny the Younger is interesting. He was a governor somewhere in Anatolia, I think, which is like modern day Turkey. And he was writing a letter to Trajan, and this is like 110 AD. And he's telling Trajan that he has this problem with these Christians, and so he's asking kind of for advice on what to do. And so the issue with the Christians, the reason it comes up is because of this Roman law that you're not allowed to meet in any sort of group at all, period, because you might start a rebellion. And he's telling Trajan that this leads to some problems because it's illegal for a fire brigade to meet. So the way they used to put out fires was they would have a local group of people who would be like the local firemen, and they would go and put out a fire when it started. But this was now illegal because any meeting of a group of people might be a mob that would start a rebellion. So you're not allowed to go in your group of firemen to put out a fire. So a fire would start and it would just burn forever because no one could put it out. So this was a big problem he's worried about. So this is, in case you thought that the incredible stupidity of government intervention was invented in America, this is going back to Rome. This was already unbelievably stupid government laws that just allow things to burn down because no one is allowed to meet together and create a fire brigade. So the other group, other than the fire brigades, the other issue is that the Christians, he catches them meeting, which they're not allowed to do. And I think there's three reasons this is important. First of all, because he says he gives them a chance to recant, and he says they have to worship the pagan gods instead of Christ. And this is important because there are no records of anyone ever recanting. So none of the apostles, when they were put to death, ever recanted. If they made this up, at some point, it would seem logical that maybe if they're going to be killed for it, if this was just some crazy story, some scheme they had, why wouldn't they just say, oh yeah, we just made this up, right? The other reason it's important is because he mentions that they worship this guy, Christus, as if he was a god. So we see this early on in like 110 AD already, they're worshiping him as a god. Because some people say this is something that was invented later, like the Council of Nicaea. Constantine sat down at the Council of Nicaea and made up the whole Bible, wrote it all down right there, and said that Jesus was God. The third reason that this is important is because this guy, who's a governor in Turkey, already in 110 AD, he's dealing with the Christians as being a significant problem for him. So it shows how quickly Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire early on. So those are the four Roman sources. Two Jewish sources that are important. Josephus, he mentions the issue with John the Baptist, who John the Baptist was, the fact that John the Baptist was put to death. Then he mentions briefly who Jesus was, the fact that Jesus was crucified. And there's part of this which pretty much everyone thinks was added later on, where there's like one sentence in the middle where it just says Jesus was the Messiah. In the middle of this explanation of Jesus, which mostly is negative towards Jesus and towards Christians, but in the middle it says, oh yeah, and he was the Messiah. And one reason that we know that that can't be what Josephus really wrote is because we have early church fathers who criticize Josephus. They quote Josephus throughout their work, and they criticize him for not recognizing that Jesus was the Messiah. So I think like Origen and Eusebius, I think they mentioned Josephus, and they say, I can't believe this guy denied that Jesus was the Messiah, right? So they know his work, and they know that he denied that he was the Messiah. So we know that was added later. But we also know that the other stuff was there earlier because it's quoted by the early church fathers. And it's quoted by Origen in his public writings, in his debates with Celsus. So if he was making this stuff up, this would obviously be available to every Roman who could just go to the library and get Josephus, which we also know from other sources. We know Josephus was in the library in Rome from other sources. So you can't just make up something, claim that Josephus had said this stuff. And then Josephus also mentions James, Jesus' brother, and when James is put to death later by the Jewish council. And the other Jewish source is the Talmud. This one is not as useful because we don't know exactly who wrote it, and there's many different periods where things were inserted about Jesus, and most of them are later, like 200 years afterwards or later than that. The reason that it is kind of interesting is because they attack Jesus in the same way that Celsus does. They don't deny the miracles. They certainly don't deny that he existed. And they just say that the miracles were done through the power of Satan, that they were just black magic. And they also say that he went to Egypt and learned sorcery and black magic and this stuff. So those are the non-Christian sources. More importantly for our discussion are the Christian sources. So Bart Ehrman, in this book, Did Jesus Exist? So he believes that there are, at bare minimum, 17 independent traditions going back to Jesus. And he doesn't trust them all as being completely accurate, obviously, because he doesn't believe in the miracles or the resurrection. But he thinks that they're accurate enough to affirm the basic things about Jesus' life and his existence. So his list is Mark, at least one source. He probably more than one source for Mark. Q, which is the stuff that we see in both Luke and Matthew, but not in Mark, and he says that's at least one other source. N, which is the stuff that's in Matthew, but not in Luke or Mark, and he says that is at least one other source, maybe two or three or more. And then L, which is the stuff that's in Luke, but not in Matthew or Mark, which once again, it could be two or three other sources, but it's at least one other source. Then he breaks John into at least three. He thinks John has to be at least three. I think the reason he does this, though, is because he has to reject the idea that the Apostle John actually wrote this. So I would say it's more likely that the Apostle John wrote this than it's one source, which is the Apostle. So ironically, Ehrman has to say it's more sources in order to get around the Apostle writing it. So I would say it's less. I would say it's one source. It's just the Apostle John. Ehrman would say, oh, it's multiple different things put together. So we can talk about that later. One of the things about John, which Ehrman does actually admit this, is that the entire thing is written in the same voice, basically. So it's the same voice writing the whole thing, which to me makes it unlikely that it's multiple sources put together, in the sense that Mark and Matthew and Luke appear to be multiple sources put together. Whereas John, it does kind of seem like when you ask an old man to tell you stories about something, and he just goes on forever with these recollections of what happened. And it's all in the same voice, so everyone speaks in the same voice in John. So anyway, I think the case for the Apostle John writing John is pretty good, but we can talk about that later. Then the eighth source for Ehrman is the Gospel of Thomas. He thinks there are things in Thomas. Thomas is the earliest of the Gnostic Gospels, and there are things in Thomas which are not in any of the other sources, so he thinks that must have been a separate tradition as well. Then he says Paul is a separate source, and with Paul, there are places where he quotes earlier traditions. He appears to be quoting earlier Christian traditions, but we don't find them anywhere else. We don't find them in any of the other Gospels or in any of the other letters. So this is another source that Paul had. Then Peter, Ehrman breaks both letters from Peter that are officially from Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter, into two separate sources. He doesn't think Peter wrote either of these, and he thinks that two different people wrote them. His main reason for arguing that is that Peter would have been illiterate and wouldn't have been able to write and wouldn't have known Greek.
And it's in excellent Greek.
And it's in excellent Greek. So I don't have too much of a problem with thinking that Peter had someone write things down for him, because we know Paul had a scribe write things down for him. So the idea that Peter had someone write things down for him in Greek, I don't think is too much of a stretch. But anyway, so he says two sources for these Peter letters. The speeches and Acts, he also says, are a separate source from Luke. Even though Luke wrote both, well, Ehrman doesn't think Luke wrote both, but whoever he thinks wrote both Luke and Acts, uses a different source for the speeches of Peter and the other apostles in Acts. Because if he had just been making these speeches up, he would have just quoted what he had already in Luke and put it into their mouth. But it's very different. And actually, Peter's speeches in Acts are very similar to Mark, but they're not similar to Luke. So this is another good argument, I think, for the fact that Mark is based on Peter's preaching, which is what the early church father Papias, who was a disciple of John, Papias quotes John the Apostle as saying that Mark was the scribe for Peter, and that Mark wrote down what Peter said when Peter would go and give speeches as a missionary. So then Ehrman gives another, the 12th, I think this is 13th source, is Hebrews, and he doesn't think that Paul wrote Hebrews. He doesn't know who wrote Hebrews, but there are things in Hebrews that we don't see anywhere else. This is another independent tradition. Then Revelation, he doesn't think this is from John the Apostle. It's another independent tradition. Jude, he doesn't know who wrote this, but there are also things that are unique to Jude. Then there are Ignatius and Clement, who are two very early church fathers from the late 1st century, early 2nd century. Clement's letters actually almost got into the New Testament. They were kind of on the periphery there. They were close to being canonical. And there are things in Ignatius and Clement about Jesus that are not direct quotes from anything else that we have. So they may have had another independent tradition according to Ehrman. So the bare minimum for Ehrman is 17 sources, probably much more. Let's see. Okay, so some other things that are important are the number of manuscripts we have for the New Testament, very high number. Of Greek manuscripts, Ehrman says about 5,700 Greek manuscripts. So this is pre-Middle Ages. And then in Middle Ages we have from Nicaea up to the Middle Ages, we have 10,000 copies of Latin manuscripts. And then we have about 10,000 other copies, which is a range of languages. Ethiopian, 2,000 Ethiopian, which really surprised me. Coptic, Armenian. Armenia was an officially Christian country before Constantine made Rome Christian.
Really?
Armenia had some independence from Rome, and they officially made themselves Christian in 301 or something.
How did Christianity diffuse from Armenia?
What?
How did Christianity diffuse to Armenia?
Diffuse?
Yeah. Was it contagious diffusion? How did it get, layman's terms, how did it get there?
Well,
Because the missionaries weren't sent over there on it. Were they?
we know that it was spread throughout the Roman Empire pretty early on. In little bits, in little pockets. So 301 for Armenia is pretty
It's
simple.
not much of a stretch. Okay.
Yeah. What?
250 years, maybe. That's a long time.
I would say it was probably in Armenia way before then,
Yeah.
but not enough to make it an official religion.
It's a long time to get there and spread and
Oh, yeah.
cultivate.
Yeah. So altogether about 25,000 Middle Ages and before sources, copies of manuscripts for the New Testament. So to compare that to other sources, there's a good table here in this book, which for the most part, this book isn't great, or I would recommend the other books above this one that I'm using. But they do have this interesting table in here. So some other historical comparisons we can use. For example, Caesar's Gallic Wars. We have 10 copies. The earliest copy is from 900 AD, which is 1,000 years after it was written. Another example is Herodotus' History. We have 8 copies, and the earliest copy is from 1,350 years after it was written. For Thucydides, we have 8 copies, and the earliest copy is 1,300 years afterwards. I assume that's the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. I'm not sure. So for the New Testament, we have 5,700. And as far as how close they are to the original writing, we have 114 fragments from within 50 years of the writing. We have 200 full books from within 100 years. We have 250 copies of most of the New Testament, not the entire New Testament, from within 150 years. And we have 325 copies of the complete New Testament from within 225 years. So this is excellent sources. These are excellent sources that we have for the New Testament. And we have them in multiple languages from throughout the Roman Empire. So it would be hard for any one person to have control of what's going to be in these sources because we have this spreading out so early throughout the empire. This huge number of sources does lead to a huge number of discrepancies. So Bart Ehrman will mention that we have hundreds of thousands of discrepancies in the New Testament in all the different manuscripts. I think that it's true, but it's kind of misleading. So if we took like a modern history book, like like
Guns, Germs, and Steel.
yeah, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Malcolm X, autobiography of Malcolm X, let's say, 25,000 copies of that. So let's say we take 25,000 copies, and half of them are printed in Great Britain, half of them are printed in the US. We're going to have hundreds of thousands of discrepancies because we spell words differently in Great Britain and in the US. So that's what most of these discrepancies are. These are spelling errors. And if you think about, throughout the Roman Empire, you have everyone using Greek. Everyone is going to have different spellings.
And words translate differently from language to language.
Yeah, and since originally everything was spoken in Aramaic, when you're translating into Greek, it's going to be slightly different for that reason as well. And even within the same region, you have different spellings. Ehrman mentions one case where the same scribe in the same manuscript spells the same word differently in the same sentence. He just doesn't care. He's just spelling the same word differently. It's not a big deal as long as people know what word he's trying to use. So this is just a different culture. You don't have spell check, and it's just as long as people know what you mean, it's okay if you spell a little bit differently. So the huge number of discrepancies, I think, is very misleading when Ehrman says that we have hundreds of thousands of discrepancies. There are a few serious issues. There's three really big ones. And we'll go over this more in detail later, I assume. But the end of Mark, we know, and we've known for a long time, was not in the original text. It's not in any of the original Greek, the earliest Greek manuscripts we have. The end of Mark is like where it says that you'll be able to handle snakes and get bitten by snakes and not get hurt and drink poison and not die and stuff like that. We also know that John 8 was not in the original. It's not in any of the originals. Although Papias talks about the story from John 8, when he talks about his conversations with John the Apostle, he says that he was told by John of this story of a woman who was falsely accused of adultery and brought before Jesus. So it's possible that this tradition was passed on and later added in, as opposed to something that's completely made up, like possibly the end of Mark was completely made up, possibly. And it's also a weird story to make up in John 8 because Jesus is writing in the sand, and we're not told what he's writing. So it's one of those weird eyewitness details that is left unexplained, and if you're making up a story, you probably wouldn't put something like that in there. Right. And then the other one is 1 John, the letter from John, 1 John 5, I think 7 through 8, which is a really obvious addition later, which is an explicit definition of the Trinity that was added in the Middle Ages. So none of the early Greek texts have this Trinitarian thing, and so this was late Middle Ages that this was added. And this was really only a problem because the Greek text that was used to translate the King James Bible happened to have this in there. But the Greek texts that were used for everyone else's Bibles, like Luther's Bible in Germany, didn't have this. There's really only a problem with people who used King James that this Trinitarian thing was used. So those are the three big issues of all these 100,000 discrepancies that are mentioned. A lot of people have heard of this Council of Nicaea, sort of, it's like a big conspiracy issue, that everything was invented at the Council of Nicaea. If we had no manuscripts, if we got rid of every single manuscript we had in every single language, in Greek, Latin, everything else, and we got rid of every single Bible we had, we could reconstruct the entire New Testament, other than 11 verses, the entire New Testament only using quotes from church fathers before the Council of Nicaea. So if we just take the writings of the early church fathers before Nicaea, we can already reconstruct everything in the New Testament, other than 11 verses. So we have pretty good reason to believe that this stuff was already established before Nicaea. And we have 32,000 altogether quotes of the New Testament by the church fathers before Nicaea. And Tatian, this is an interesting guy, he wrote a harmony of the Gospels, which is called the Diatessaron. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But he wrote this in 160 AD, and this is basically put all the Gospels together and tried to make it into one Gospel. And this is a pretty early date to already have all the Gospels the way that we accept them today, and to know that this is what's widely accepted in the church, and to try to put them together into one coherent story.